Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a pleasure to rise here and speak on Bill 4, the Public Interest Disclosure Act. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, I'm unable to support this bill as it is currently written. As a new member, I've had the honour and privilege of working very closely with the honourable member from Calgary-Fish Creek, and as Yoda has said, smart she is. I have listened intensely to her passion, to her dedication for the most vulnerable in society, the seniors, the children, and others who are afraid to speak up for themselves, and for those that care for them. Many of you in this House have worked with this honourable member, and you know that this dedication and passion has guided many such pieces of legislation in this House. And that is why we should all strive to learn from this member who has worked diligently on promoting the effectiveness of this House and ensure that we protect Albertans with good legislation. Mr. Speaker, it is worth noting that this is the first time the government has brought forward whistleblower legislation in the Assembly. As I said, my colleague from Calgary-Fish Creek has worked tirelessly on this type of legislation, and it's good to see the government finally taking this issue seriously enough to bring this legislation to us. The problem is the legislation is not enough. Mr. Speaker, like many Albertans, I've had time to reflect on so many situations in which this government has not been held accountable. We see how an out-of-touch PC party has accepted thousands of dollars in illegal donations, and one donation of $430,000 possibly from a single individual. While the government was so blatantly wrong on these issues, they were still shocked that anyone could accuse them of wrongdoing. The article that I'm referring to is simply many of the articles that we have read over this past week. This is an out-of-touch PC government that seems impossible of recognizing its own problems. Unfortunately, I think that could be the theme of Bill 4. We have a government that is incapable of recognizing its own problems. This bill seems as if it was carefully drafted to make sure it doesn't address the problems that need to be addressed. After what has been presented to us in Bill 4, it seems as if it was carefully crafted by a government so that it would not apply to them. You will notice that the intimidation of medical staff, the donations by prohibited corporations, it's not covered. How can this be? How does this government not draft legislation that ensures that all are protected, regardless of date and time of when that protection was required? What would they be afraid of? Nothing to hide? Why not do it? We don't need to go too far into these issues, but it is fair to say that this is an area where this government has hurt the public's trust. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, we have to make sure that whistleblower protection applies to organizations that receive government funding, like our senior centres. If seniors or those who help our seniors want to blow the whistle about ethical lapses or financial mismanagement in our senior centres, this legislation should protect them. It does no such thing. How does this government rationalize that the most vulnerable people who are begging for protection have no avenue to come forward without retaliation or fear? Is this government telling these people and frontline workers that they don't matter and they are not important enough to have the protection if they need it? The fact that this legislation seems to stick handle around these very areas is telling of how sincere this government is about effective whistleblower protection. This bill is flawed that it would not apply to the gross violations we have seen recently in this province. Mr. Speaker, the government is failing to recognize its own problems. Mr. Speaker, let's recognize what's at stake here. Adopting whistleblower protection is significant, being that this is the first time we're allowing government employees to come forward when they know of law-breaking and gross, I'm saying gross, mismanagement in the public sector. This will benefit our province in so many ways and for generations to come. Checks and balances are not just about the opposition parties keeping the governing party honest. Proper checks and balances also include average people who care about our province coming forward to let the public know that illegal behaviour and improper spending in our government. We should allow and encourage any individual to do just that. Mr. Speaker, this bill is about more than whistleblowers. This bill is about integrity. Integrity in the process, integrity in the system, and integrity in government. Albertans want integrity, they want protection, and they want to ensure that they can come forward if they need to. They want that security. As elected officials, it is key that we ensure that they have that ability. I have a tremendous amount of respect for whistleblowers. Mr. Speaker, I was recently elected to this Assembly, so I understand what people say outside of the dome of the legislature. There is a lack of trust for elected officials and how they manage the public purse. And after scandals like the recent health expense scandal, who can blame them? We should recognize that this is a problem and do something, just something about it. Instead, the government has failed to recognize their problems and has brought forward legislation to protect the government from whistleblowers, not whistleblowers from the government. It's as if they want to create a system where Morale would continue to pay his butler on the public dime, but the government wouldn't get in trouble for it. It's as if the government wants to create a system where the intimidation of healthcare professionals continues, but it doesn't become public. It's as if the government wants to spend $113,000 on unused, luxurious hotel rooms, but doesn't want to have to explain that to the public. This is the wrong message to send to the public, but it's just what Bill 4 does. This is another broken promise from the Premier, who promised protection for whistleblowers regardless of the manner in which they choose to disclose their wrongdoings. But, Mr. Speaker, what has surprised me this week is how the government has brought this bill forward. Since releasing the Public Interest Disclosure Act, those on the other side of the House have been trying to build this up to say that it goes further than any other piece of legislation in Canada, and that, it's really hard for me to actually say this, it sets a new bar for accountability and transparency. Well, if it does, if that doesn't prove the government is failing to recognize its own problem, I don't know what does. This bill has been opposed by opposition parties, ordinary Albertans, and stakeholders. David Hutton, who has already been referred to today, the Executive Director of the Federal Accountability Initiative for Reform, which is a charity focused on improving whistleblower protection, gave his opinion of this bill last week. He called the release of this bill disappointing, said that if this act passes, it compels the whistleblower to enter a secretive, bureaucratic, and tightly managed process, which is likely to bury their allegations and is unlikely to protect anyone except the wrongdoers. More importantly, Mr. Speaker, and this is very concerning, is the hypocrisy of this government. How are we to have any faith in this failed legislation when even the own Minister of the own Associate Minister of Accountability, Transparency and Transformation has awkwardly come out against this bill? The Associate Minister has publicly stated that if he had cause to use this legislation, he wouldn't. He'd go to the Ethics Commissioner. If the Minister himself cannot endorse and trust this legislation, how can he possibly expect that Albertans would support legislation that he himself does not even stand behind? Mr. Speaker, we can do better than that on an issue as important as whistleblower protection. My colleagues and I could just vote against this bill, but that's not what Albertans sent us here to do. I would hope that the members across the floor would remember the respect that they had for the honourable member of Calgary-Fish Creek and actually review her amendments and give serious thought to them. We want to make this bill better. We want to work with all members of this House to ensure that we enact legislation that is effective and just. We will be bringing forward amendments that can do just that, and I hope the government will work with us in implementing things and raise that bar and ensure that whistleblower protection is strong. We still have the opportunity to make this legislation one that sets a new bar for accountability and transparency. It will take a lot of work, but it's something that I believe is entirely possible if the government decides to hear what Albertans are saying, as opposed to telling them what they need to hear. We can work together in this Assembly. We can build off each other's strengths. We can pass a good piece of legislation. Cooperation, listening, and the ability to want to do the right thing is all it takes. And I implore this government to do that with Bill 4.
Yeah. Here, here.